GIT 500 Data Collection. Research really depends on data collection, so it's really important to get that part of the research exactly right, or as close to exactly right as you can. Some methods restrict the type and the nature of the data collector. These are used in quantitative studies, and then others are more flexible and often developed during the study, and these are used in qualitative studies. The true approaches for getting data are what we call primary data from primary sources and secondary data from secondary sources. Primary data is information that you gather directly from participants or subjects in the study or through observations of the subjects by the researcher. That the researcher themselves get the data from the participants directly. Secondary data is from secondary sources. That is information that has been previously gathered, such as data in a database or records from a business, or even prior research from other researchers and other studies, and even your own prior research is considered secondary data. One primary source of data is through observations, which are just what you think they are, watching and listening to an interaction or a phenomenon or something that's happening. You're really interested in the subject's behaviors rather than their perceptions of their what they think. An example would be to find out how a group of subjects will react to a violent or scary movie. You would want to watch them as they watch it. There are two types of observation. There's participant observation, where the researcher participates as one of the group members in the group activities, and non-participant observation, where the researcher does not get involved. They just sit back and observe. Some possible problems that might occur through observation is something we call the Hawthorne effect, and that's just when people they know they're being observed, they change their behavior to match what they think you want them to do. Observer might be biased, so if the observer is not unbiased, they may interpret what they see incorrectly. Data might be incomplete because through the observation recording, whether it's done on videotape, audio, or notes, may not have concluded all the pertinent information that should have been collected. And then varied interpretation. So different researchers, different observers will see the same things differently and interpret them differently. When recording what is being observed, there's two ways you can approach it. It can be a narrative recording where the researcher makes notes and then later writes them up in narrative form. They might also record interviews on video or audio and then make notes from those. Or by having a predetermined scale or set of scales which they can rate or categorize certain aspects about what they have been observing. Another primary source of data is through interviews. And this is commonly used when you need to collect information on a very specific or for a very specific purpose. An example would be to find out what a website user liked or disliked about a website during a usability test. Interviews can be done for more detailed feedback from the participant. There are different kinds of interviews. There's unstructured, where the researcher really has flexibility in choosing questions. So they ask questions depending on what they have observed. Or structured, where the researcher sticks to a specific set of interview questions and asks the same questions of every participant. The advantages of interviews are that you can really get in deep in complex situations, get that in-depth information. You can ask follow-up questions so you can supplement the information that you get. You can explain the questions, which if it was a written survey, you would not have that opportunity. You can use interviews for a wider population, say if you wanted to know, senior citizens' opinions about website navigation. You might get better information by interviewing them. Disadvantages is that it is time consuming and expensive. The quality of the data depends on the quality of the interview itself and also of the interviewer and how well they do. And then if you have multiple people interviewing different people, they may all have different levels of quality. So you may get really good in-depth questions from one interviewer but not from another interviewer. So you have to watch out for that. And of course, there's always the possibility of researcher bias in the way the questions are asked or the way the answers are interpreted. Another primary source, and this is what we commonly use in this class, is the survey, or some people call it a questionnaire. I'm going to be calling it a survey from here on out. It's just a written list of questions or items, and then the participant record their responses on the survey. It's called a data collection instrument, and actually any list of questions at all, whether it's an interview or an observation, that is called an instrument as well. But we're going to be focusing on the survey as a data collection instrument. For example, you can use a survey to ask a standard set of questions with predetermined answers about why a user likes or dislikes the navigation of a website. There are two types of questions. There's a closed question, and a closed question, I'll show you here in a minute, but it's participants have to choose from a list of predetermined answers. And then open-ended questions are when the user can basically enter their own answer. The advantages of surveys and questionnaires are that they are less expensive to administer. They can be sent out on email or regular mail. They can be handed out and gathered in a public place like a public library or a grocery store. They can be gathered through what we call a collective administration, and that's just when you have a captive audience like a face-to-face class, or maybe a business meeting or a community meeting, and you hand out and collect surveys in that way. It provides greater anonymity for participants because you usually do not collect their names or any personal information that might identify them. Disadvantages are that you can only get so many people, right? So this limits your population that you can get data from. Sometimes, and usually you get a low response rate. We like to think like if you get 30% of the total that you sent out back, that's pretty good. A lot of people also self-select based on the topic, so it kind of creates a possible bias that way from having participants who believe in that thing that you're asking about or have strong feelings about that thing, where other people are like and so they don't fill out the survey. The researchers can't clarify the questions. We talked about that before, and there's really no way to get spontaneous answers or ask further questions. And answers can be influenced by other questions on the survey or even other people just in the room when they were the participants taking the survey. We talked about this previously. There are basically two question types. There's open-ended and closed. Open-ended is where the participant can put down their own answers in their own words, or interviewer writes down or records the participant's answers, depending on if it's an interview or if it's a survey. Closed is where there are predetermined responses given with the question, and that's what the participants have to choose from. In surveys, this can, and I always say should, include an other option that then allows participants to write in their answer. The advantages and disadvantages of open-ended is that you can get some really great in-depth information and people can explain their answers, but then it's more difficult to analyze. So if you have an open-ended question, particularly people do this, how old are you? Well, if you have 50 participants and you ask how old are you, you might get 50 different answers, or you might get 20, 30-year-olds and 5, 60-year-olds, and you have to analyze all that. So it's more difficult to analyze certain information. Closed is less in depth, however, because you're giving them the answers, and that might also show some researcher bias based on the answers that you give. So you have to be very careful that you give answers that are not, possible answers that are not biased. And then participants go through surveys, and if they're not really interested, they just quickly check things without really considering a question. But the advantage is it's much easier and faster to analyze. We go back to the question about age. If we're grouping ages, rather than saying, just tell me your age, and then I have to go through as a researcher and make the groups. If you give them, 18 to 25, 26 to 35, so on, and they choose groups of ages, an age group, that's much easier to analyze. Secondary sources, again, are data collected by others or that you collected for maybe a different purpose or different research. Examples of this are government databases, people's personal records, including like medical records, mass media, so information that has been put out in the newspapers and in the news. So these, I just put these here because these are two really good GIT related databases for secondary information, secondary sources. The Pew Research Center, and then the ACM special interest groups, which include SIGCHI, SIGDoc, SIGGRAPH, SIGWeb, and those are groups that collect and publish their own research, and you can use that information as it applies to your research. The advantages of secondary sources are that it can save you time and money. If somebody else has already gathered data that pertains to your research topic, you don't have to do it. It'll save you time and possibly money. Sometimes you have to pay for databases, but it will definitely be cheaper than going and getting the information yourself. Those databases usually contain really large research project data, and that has been gathered from a larger population. So that is probably more than you could do yourself. You don't have to gather the data, right? The disadvantages are you don't know how valid or reliable those sources are. You can't be sure that the researcher didn't have a bias. And the data may not be available that you need. And the data format might not match up easily with what you need to do with it. So there's some pluses and minuses there. What we talked about in data collection are there are two approaches of data collection, primary and secondary. Again, primary is when you observe people, you do interviews, or you get data through surveys and questionnaires. And secondary is information that comes from databases, from published research, from your own previous research.